Hello, my name is Andy Gilman with the Agora Foundation. On Friday, August 11th, Tom Krause and I interviewed Tom Maloney and Tania Parker of the Ojai Valley Land Conservancy. We wanted to understand better what the Land Conservancy's priorities were in our valley and also anticipate their soon to be released 5-year strategic plan. We hope you enjoy the conversation. There'll be links to the strategic plan, and please let us know if you have any questions. Enjoy. So let me start. Welcome here. Thanks for your time here today. And the Land Conservancy is something that is dear to many of our hearts in our valley. So for those who don't know, can you give us a brief history of the Land Conservancy, how it started and how it's evolved?
I'll let Tanya start since she's been here the longest of all of us, right, on staff.
Yeah. So the Land Conservancy was founded by a group of individuals who really saw a broader vision for the valley, giving the valley an alternative to development and some of the big projects that were going on. So we became a nonprofit in 1987. Ellen Hall, who recently passed, was a big part of that, one of the two founding members. And in 1997, we were donated our first property. And that's pretty normal for a land trust to take a long time to be known in the community and gain respect and gain that trust to start to be trusted with their lands.
And that was the Il Vento Preserve at Thatcher, and Dr. Il Vento just passed away over in Santa Barbara. I got that from at least half a dozen people. Said,
No, thanks.
And then we grew from there. People like John Brazenly, who also just passed, were really instrumental in acquiring the Ojai Meadows Preserve and the Ventura River Preserve, and those two really started to set us apart into the trajectory that we're in today.
And Phil, who's on the school board, was also a part of that early group.
He was.
Okay.
Yeah, and then he went away to be a parent for a while, and now he's back on our board.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And I would say that the 80s were a time, so the land trust movement in the New World started with the Trustees of Reservations about 135 years ago in Massachusetts, and then the Isaac Walton League and some other organizations. The Nature Conservancy was founded in 1953. But it wasn't until like the late 70s and 80s when land trust really took off, and so we're right in there with this whole explosion of the land trust movement in the United States.
So a land trust is a legal identification, it's a legal.
It absolutely
How
is.
does that work?
So there's there's 501c3, which is charities, which you're familiar with, and then there's Section 170, which qualifies you as a conservation entity under the tax code to hold land for conservation purposes. And so these things called conservation easements can only be held by a Section 170 organization. And tax deductions, if you were going to donate your land, for instance, you have to donate it to a Section 170 interest if it's for conservation purposes. Of course, you could donate it to the Agora Foundation. They could sell it and use the proceeds. But
And this was a federal legislation with the objective of providing a mechanism to preserve
for private lands conservation.
private land conservation.
Yeah. And as you might imagine, it was very popular in the East, but as you get west with all the federal land and state lands in the West, it was a little bit more of a slow uptake. And now there's a profound debate in Western land conservation between private lands and public lands. For instance, Western senators have helped create a law that if you do a conservation easement that allows the continued agricultural use, say ranching for this example, you can take a 15-year tax deduction off your income, which is extraordinary. But if you sell it into the federal system, that doesn't exist. Or if you even donate it, so there's a tension between public land and private land in the West, which isn't an issue here in Ojai. You know, I mean, we've got 2.1 million acres just to our north here.
And
So the Meadow Preserve, was that donated or purchased? Things like that.
yeah, the Meadows Preserve was purchased.
Okay.
We purchased land either depending on whether it qualifies for grants, like the Meadows Preserve was a big project with both private donations from the community, but also major grants from Caltrans, because it was really to help reduce and stop the flooding that was happening on Highway 33.
I remember.
But then something like the Valley View Preserve is really a community benefit. It didn't qualify for grants, and that was 100% fundraised from the community.
Okay.
But one note about land trusts too is land trusts as a whole have protected, it's been a while since the last census, but I think it's 5 times more land than all the national parks combined in all 50 states.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's great to know.
It's a massive movement. I'm going to the rally next month.
Okay.
When
Yeah.
there'll be 3,000.
Well,
land
I
trust
just want
nerds
to tell you,
from all
when I
over.
was a kid, behind Nordhoff, people used to dump their trash. So when I was growing up, that's what was behind Nordhoff, which is the Meadow Preserve now.
Oh, yeah.
It's an incredible change, like extraordinary.
My
So,
friend's dad was
kudos
a
to the
tomato farmer there.
Yeah?
I had no idea.
Wow, I didn't
Yeah.
know that either.
We'll keep coming back to the Meadows Preserve
Yeah.
because as part of our 5-year vision, that enhancement of ecosystem services is central to this, responding to climate change.
No, thanks. And then how did you two individually come to the Land Conservancy?
So I think this month I will have been at the Land Conservancy for 10 years.
Oh.
I
We don't have a tenure.
Well, now we will see.
But it's funny, I have a degree in natural resources management, but I had never heard of a land trust. I didn't know what they were.
Right.
And the previous director asked me to apply for the job, 2 previous directors, at the gym. We worked out at the same hour at the athletic club. And so that's how I got to Land Conservancy. And I was hired specifically to rebrand and market it to make it the most known nonprofit in the Valley. And I think we've been pretty successful at that.
And I've had a long, diverse career on both coasts in conservation. People often ask, well, how'd you come to conservation? My brother lived on Nantucket as a scallop fisherman for 20 years, and my brother-in-law grew up there. And when you spend time, particularly in the fall and winter, on a small island 30 miles off the coast of Massachusetts, and you see a brand new, 4,500 square foot house on the place you were maybe duck hunting or birding the year before, you start to really feel the impacts of development and the loss of things you cherish, places you cherish. And so I decided after my slacker years to go to grad school. I've had several jobs of diverse career, mostly on land and water conservation. And I was doing a very interesting and intellectually stimulating job up in Oakland, and Jesse Grantham called, the former birdman of Ojai, and said, would you even, I remember I was doing my back exercises on the floor of the living room. So would you even think about that? And I was like, Ojai, Oakland, and so I came about 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's great. And then just before we get into the strategic plan and things that you guys are proposing, what are the concrete responsibilities and the focus areas of Land Conservancy? So in other words, if somebody is trying to ask the quick question, what are you responsible for, or what do you do? What would those main buckets be?
Well, OVLC, Ojai Valley Land Conservancy's a bit, and this comes up again later in your series of questions, we're a little bit different than some land trusts in that we have so much public access. I mean, we're sort of a de facto parks department here in the Valley,
Yeah.
with our big preserves and the really heavy visitorship on our preserves. So I think the stewardship of our lands is, in terms of chief responsibilities or principal responsibilities, that's always right there. And because our conservation is perpetual, and perpetual is a really long time, we have to raise the money and sort of fund that long-term stewardship. So that's paramount.
Okay.
And I'd say the second most thing.
The Conservancy owns 2,400 acres
Oh, thank
of
you.
land,
Okay, thanks.
and we maintain roughly 27 miles of trail in the valley.
And most of it's open, obviously with 27 miles of trails, most of it's open for public access. There's a lot of land trusts have no public access,
Right,
or
right.
a little circle around the pond. But as a land trust, really, the other core responsibility is to protect land. And every decision you make should always be around, okay, how can we protect land? And we'll delve into our how we make those decisions.
Right.
And then increasingly we're seeing with, again, we'll get into this, but a responsibility, we added restorers to our mission. With a changing climate, restoring habitat is paramount. So we see that as a responsibility as well.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
restoring habitat is a different kind of project in the sense that you're not necessarily buying the
Yes,
the
and we'll
land?
get into this. I mean, for instance, along San Antonio Creek, the giant reed, we did a very big project and worked with a bunch of private landowners to just get the reed off of their land. We don't actually have any land tenure agreement or interest in the land there. as much as we'd like to. In fact, we just bought 9.55 acres. That owner had let us take out their Arundel and said, okay, well, now I'll sell you our land.
And we had done with a grant, we took out the Arundo, and we had done restoration on their property with a grant.
Yeah, to plant native species.
And then they sold us the land, so it was a really nice full circle.
So I think those are like, and then the focal areas we'll get into as part of our new strategic plan.
I do want to point out, because I have to admit it goes away from my attention, and that is, if, let's say, the river bottom or the meadow preserve did not have the hiking trails, you wouldn't have to be paying to maintain it in the same way you do now. So that's a huge part of what you guys
Not
do.
even remotely.
Okay, it's good. That's really helpful for people to understand that I mean, me included, I take it for granted that here's a resource now in my valley that I get to go hike.
Yeah.
But somebody's paying for the upkeep, and that's you guys.
It's interesting
Okay.
when people call to complain that we cut a eucalyptus or we might have sprayed some herbicide somewhere. I sometimes, while they're on the phone, I check, and they say they've hiked there every day for 30 years and they've never donated a red sign to us. And it kind of changes my viewpoint about their investment in the place.
And that's really our biggest cost in a way is we can get grants for restoration, we can get grants for land acquisition, and we can fundraise in different ways, and everyone's really excited to donate to buy a new parcel. But just the maintenance of the day-to-day trails, and this year it rained so much we had to clear the trails 3 times. We had to weed whack the trails 3 times.
Not to mention the repairs.
And so the stewardship of those lands, if it was just open space and we didn't have to maintain trails, and it would be a very, very different cost.
And I know this was an issue in the past. This is off our questions a bit, but tourism in Ojai seems to include things like being able to hike in the river bottom and walk along these creeks, and there's been mixed engagement with some of the hotels in the past, at least. How much they're supporting you or not supporting you, but using your land, using the land.
The way I put that is, if you go to the top of Signal on a Saturday afternoon, there's a line of cream-colored of spikes there.
I do.
With a little basket
I do it all
on
the time.
And having said that, we're deepening our relationships with the inn, particularly, and the social club has been very generous to us. So I think if there was a subtext to that in the past, it's improving.
I'm glad.
We're working on it.
Yeah,
I'm glad.
So deepening your relationship with the inn, can you say more about that?
Just showing that we are part of why people come to Ojai. Very much so. Like,
is the inn favorable to the project?
Yeah,
absolutely.
so
Land Conservancy?
Absolutely, yeah.
And they also own a big piece of San Antonio Creek, for which we were able to get a grant to remove the Arundo on their property, and then the inn is paying us
to plant natives
and do restoration on their creek.
Oh,
yeah.
So they're funding the restoration.
So they're supportive financially as well as
absolutely.
in
Yeah,
kind of
we
theory.
have a 4-year contract to establish a nice riparian buffer where the Arundo has already grown back, but will have had been because of permit constraints. We couldn't do it the proper way last year, and then the flooding. When we can geek out on Arundo all we want, but the flooding caused a whole new set of problems with regard to the giant reed.
Is there tension in that relationship at all? I mean, is it you both want the same thing? And
yeah, I mean, there's probably some tactical things that we need to talk through, but no, it's kumbaya. I think there's a lot of, I guess I'd call it enlightened self-interest at the inn to reduce their water consumption because of what's going on in the valley. And so they've been engaged a lot with Watershed Progressive, Regina Hirsch and her team, and Asia Bull-Richards, to really look at some of their designs and how they can reduce their water consumption. Obviously, Arundo is a huge water sucker, so having a really pretty riparian area is very different than a wall of giant reed. So I think there's just a ton of alignment that's emerging through the inn's acknowledgement that they have to mitigate their water demands, and our acknowledgement that, as I say, the board, water's scarcer than land in Ojai. So if we're going to be a conservancy, we got to think about the water space as well.
That's what I was trying to elaborate a little bit on, is this, I'm going to use your expression, the enlightened self-interest, that if we think of tourism in the valley in general, and everybody thinks about it, and you think of the environment and the sustainable ecology of the valley, that's in everyone's interest, commercially and in lifestyle. So I think they've come aboard more than they had in the past. That's
the inn
and anybody else.
And it to be honest, it shifts with every change in management.
I was going to ask that. Yeah, I would have thought that there's some variation across leadership there.
Over the last 10 years, I've seen several different people, and this is the closest we've worked with them.
We used to do Archie Talk was there.
Yeah.
And now we don't. So I want to get, one thing I'd love to transition to is the strategic plan. So before, this is a question that I have been asked, I don't know the answer to this. Is it published on your website now, or can people get at it?
Yes.
Okay, so maybe is a good place to start the addition of restoration as a principal focus area. Is that a good place to start?
Sure.
Okay.
When I got here and I looked at your new executive director sent me the financials. I looked at the financials, and the organization was spending way more money to restore habitat than it was acquiring land or any other program, outreach, anything else. It wasn't even remotely close. It is now. I mean, things are really growing. So I went to the board, the first rewrite before the strategic plan, right when I got here, I said, we got to add restores to the mission. You can't, you got to adhere to your mission.
And there was a little bit of legacy marketing going on there. So before I got to the Conservancy, in 2011, they had done this marketing study, and they found that nobody wants us to talk about restoration and restores, and nobody was interested in that. And so the Conservancy, all these years since the Meadow, has been doing quite a bit of restoration, more than half our budget, most of our budget for many of the years that I was there, but we just never advertised it or talked about it. And now the climate of the community has changed, and they understand the importance of restoration and the benefit that it can have to the ecosystem as well as the humans that live here. And so we're on a much different page where we acknowledge that the climate is changing and that we have a role to play in that, and that restoration is a really important part of helping the community become resilient.
The prior director had a business model for land trust that he did up at I never get the name right, even though I lived there for 10 years, the Land Conservancy of San Luis Obispo County. I think is what they call themselves. They're very particular about it. Where in Oceano Dunes and Pismo, they had a full-blown restoration program, and the state would contract them to do these restoration projects, and then that created revenue that kept the rest of the organization afloat to do land. And that model is really an innovative model. I mean, Brian deserves a lot of credit for that, because it's hard, as we said before, it's hard. The day in and day out stewardship burden of owning a bunch of land is hard. And it's a bit like journalism. You always need that timeliness angle in a story. Well, once the land's bought, it's really hard to create endowment.
I get it. Now, restoration, I just want to ask first, anybody who might not, or help me understand it better, would it be as simple as saying you're taking out the non-natives, you're planting natives, you're maybe making a swale to sequester water? What does restoration mean?
It's an emerging field. Ecological restoration has only been around since probably the 90s, early 90s. In our case, just taking giant reed or a rundo, removing a rundo and planting natives so that it's more intact and there's much less water demand and the habitat is restored for native species. Okay. Full stop. Wow. Taking an orange grove, like at the Ventura River Preserve, what was that, 40 acres of oranges, and planting hundreds of oak trees to get an intact oak woodland. Got it. That's a very different proposition for the native species here. Those are two examples of restoration.
Well, and the Ojai Meadows Preserve was a wetland. And so we brought the water back. The water now drains into the Meadows Preserve. It protects the surrounding neighborhoods and Nordoff and the highway from flooding. But also all those native plants have brought life back to the meadow. So Jesse Grantham, who we mentioned before, had a bird count of, I think, 80 species at the meadow before restoration, and we've seen, I think, 185. I think you said you added 287 species.
During the first few months of COVID, I added 2 species to the bird list there.
So,
okay.
So, one, we've been doing restoration a lot, and two, restoration takes a lot of different forms depending on whether we're working in orange groves or wetlands or riparian areas.
Okay.
One thing you said that I would draw a distinction between, and it sort of goes to some of the things we'll talk about with this new vision statement, is that's all sort of stock and trade, right? Is put natives where they weren't, where there was a farm, dry land farm, there's now a big wetland system and a park people love to go to at the Ojai Meadows Preserve. But we're in a situation now, as I say it, is when I was shopping for homes in Ojai, every place I looked at, there was an armored flood channel getting the water out of the valley as quickly as possible.
Right.
And so when you embrace a vision to help the valley adapt and be more resilient to climate change, maybe OVLC is the partner to the groundwater sustainability agencies for groundwater injection wells with a little treatment facility, which is beyond the pale for a lot of land trusts. They'd be like, no, we're not doing that. But I think that's the type of thing we should be open to if we're really going to live up to that 5-year vision. And that's different than restoration.
I get it.
Now, what role is being played in that?
Well, again, if you build a facility like that, you need a steward and a land tenure, some sort of land tenure there. And as a land trust, we could provide that for the watershed protection district or the city or the neighborhood, whoever it is.
So it's an enabling role.
It's an enabling role, and we're actually eligible for the grants, from the Wildlife Conservation Board or whoever, or the Department of Water Resources, Department of Conservation, these state agencies that would want to see that kind of enhancement of the water budget in this valley. And then again, under the threatened adjudication, there may be roles in management actions that OVLC is the likely entity to implement. Certainly Arundo. Everybody sees us as the sort of de facto leader in Arundo restoration here.
So you're including water in your conservation work. You're thinking of water now as a resource, not just land acquisition and restoration, but water now is this huge thing. And I could see how the work you're doing could create the situation that more water is running down the Ventura River, solving this problem.
Ameliorating it.
No, I'm saying helping with it.
I'm not going to go to solve.
Helping with it. I mean, what we're all doing could help with it. But so I see that you're seeing that as a factor, just like you would acquiring a piece of land. You're looking at how can we get the water back into the groundwater table.
With voluntary, classic sort of land trust, non-regulatory, voluntary measures that landowners choose to take.
And we also have, there's not a mechanism currently for if we buy the water rights on this property and don't put in that well, there's nothing from stopping the neighbor to put in that well. And so we do have a grant from a private funder as well to fund kind of workshops around
explore those issues.
Exploring those issues and bringing in water experts and looking at how we can implement some sort of water savings as well.
So there's a bit of a controversy about how much water should be diverted into the lake and how much should be allowed to continue for ecological reasons. But it's complicated, and at least in my naive view, it's complicated. It's sort of hard to understand exactly what the moving pieces are and what makes the most sense altogether. Do you have insight into that? Or
the way I say it is the Ojai Valley is like the Venn diagram of water issues in California, because we're not on state water. Our climate this winter is an example of the climate is wildly variable. You go 6 years drought and then 50 inches of rain all of a sudden. You've got a threatened adjudication. You've got one inactive because it doesn't have a problem, but 3 new groundwater sustainability agencies. You've got 2 competing flow models, and you've got water demand from sort of COVID related, but also just ex-urban migration of just development and people demanding more water. And then diminishing the agricultural base, which is so much a part of our consumptive use of water, is, it's challenging in this environment. Roger, our board chair, Roger Essick, he doesn't think avocados will be here in 10 years just because the heat factor is just crushing them. So in that Venn diagram, there's got to be a way that we can, again, cooperatively and voluntarily find ways to ameliorate the issue. I don't have the crystal ball that says it should be 14 acre feet at low flow coming through Robles and not getting diverted. And then you have Matilaha, the Matilaha Dam Removal Project, and what effect is that going to have on water sustainability in the time of climate change? I mean, as the executive director of OVLC, I see a role for us, and that's the point of this grant we got, is to sort of explore with all those potential policy levers in place, where can we start pulling on some levers to play a productive role for the community.
And I would say our vision often it gets a little bit reductive of you're either for fish or you're for water or for people in this valley. And I think that that's not really fair. We need water, and we believe in the orchards, and they add a lot to our community character. And if we want to see or have orange blossoms in the spring and have citrus be part of our lives, we need to support the ag as well. And so it's not fish or people, but in our vision we see if you have fish, that means you have a healthy riparian area and a healthy river and a healthy watershed that contributes to that, and your functioning ecosystem provides for those fish, and that functioning ecosystem provides for all of us as well. And so it's
let me double down on that before you pull that because we're talking about steelhead, and the world we ought to live in ought to have habitat that's headwaters, mid-reach river, estuary, open ocean. And that's why steelhead is a perfect umbrella species for the world we ought to want to live in. That's how I think about it.
So it isn't steelhead exactly.
No.
It's the larger picture that is represented by the survival of steelhead.
The example I can give you is, Ojai is right here on the edge of condor country. People like David Brower, the hero of Western conservation, opposed taking condors in and doing captive breeding in the 80s. I can, right now on the back of this sheet, show you 1 million acres of land conservation, of habitat conservation that has occurred because we invested in condors. People get obsessed with the single species management idea, and instead it's an emblem or an umbrella of the place we ought to want to be.
They're just now reproducing well outside. We just had a condor presentation at Rotary recently. So,
you did?
It was really good.
By Joseph, or who did it?
No, it was a woman. I forgot the agency, but yeah, maybe she's new. Yeah. But that was an incredible presentation to see the growth of the condors in the area, because I remember being a kid thinking you were never going to see one, or most likely. So that's a big success story. But your point was, this is, in a way, the steelhead would be sort of the symbol of how the system is doing, the representative example of the larger system. That's, I thought, the point you were trying to make.
Yeah, so, the argument against is the fish are not as important as the people, and to have policy determined by
the EPA.
Something that contributes to steelhead, and you can't find a steelhead if you go there.
Yeah.
There aren't any.
Right.
That's the argument. I don't know if that's right or not. That's a concern to a lot of people.
I know.
And then when people say, well, no, it's not just the fish; it's also the broader picture of the ecological system. If you're not real up on all that stuff, and you hear that, you think, is that theory? Is that ideology? Is that like it's just good? Or is that real? Is there substance to that argument, actually?
Of why we need
I just described the life history of a migratory salmonid, in this case a steelhead. So they need clean, intact ocean, estuary, mid-reach river, and headwaters.
Yeah.
That makes it an ideal.
And that's pretty concrete. That's not ideological.
That's 8th grade biology class.
Yeah.
That's a field trip in the North Coast to go see the king salmon migrating. They're all that biology. I used to work in anatomy fisheries restoration on the Connecticut River.
And so if that's given up, let's say, if the decision were made, for example, say divert all of the water and forget the steelhead.
Right.
What would the effect of that be?
There would be no. Well, one effect might be why remove Matalaha Dam then, because the principal reason, other than it's a defunct piece of failed infrastructure, that its catastrophic failure could be a lot worse than a planned removal. By the way. Why remove that? Why think about an intact national forest? Why think about removing Arundo and having an intact riparian area with a full complement of native birds? I just think it changes the world we ought to want to be in.
I also think,
and we're a conservation organization, so
sure,
of course,
yeah.
I also think that biodiversity loss, like we don't. I don't love spiders crawling across me when I'm sleeping 2 nights ago. I don't love little creepy crawly things, but also I understand the importance of bugs and the importance of having broad biodiversity in function of our entire ecosystem. And so if you're diverting all the water, you're losing all your riparian trees, you're losing your fire breaks, water's not sinking into the groundwater. The effects are broader reaching beyond the river. You're losing a lot of shade, it's gonna get hotter there. You're not bringing sediment out to the ocean. Well, the dam's stopping that anyways, but you're not having a functioning estuary, so you're losing more biodiversity there. The ripple effects go beyond protecting this fish. It goes into this intact habitat that we're realizing we need all those pollinators, we need all those plants, we need our native species.
We need in order to
clean our air and to survive and to have...
Well, we need the pollinators to grow fruit.
Yeah.
Right? So in the East End.
And I think that's a really interesting one too, because the honeybees aren't native, they're European, and we have 1,800 bee species here in California that do a lot of pollination. And so you're competing, they often get left out of the pollinator equation, but I think that in order for us to have clean air and clean water, we need to support biodiversity and land and protect those things.
Bringing it back to water, just in this context, there are abundant examples from other places where a really thoughtful analysis of our efficiencies and how we use water and how we think about water will completely ameliorate the people versus fish argument. I mean, I think it's so reductive as to sort of lose the point that we can create efficiencies in what we're doing in our built environment, so that we don't have to keep having the same debate over and over again. In other words, we can have both.
And what stands in the way of that?
Cooperation, just thoughtfulness, redesign,
getting
probably
good
always back to cash.
I was gonna say education,
what's the
too.
financial aspect of that?
Well, like we were talking about, if you were to redesign some of these armored flood channels and get some injection wells so that our groundwater just is more sustained on a year in, year out basis, everything's very costly. That's heavy machinery, that's thinking about injection wells.
Just a really simple
treatment.
example. You could see the water going down the street and it goes into, the hole, and it says floods to the ocean and all that. So it's not going nowhere, it's going down the river, which is great. But imagine if it flooded into the vacant lot over here, and then it settled down and settled into the groundwater table where we could use it first. That's what I think some of the projects from Watershed Progressive and these guys and others are doing to make, like, our groundwater table right now is so sufficient because it seems to me of that work that's happening. So when wells get sunk, they're sinking into the groundwater table, right?
Ojai even pumps, we even pump our gray water down past Foster Park.
That's right.
It's like water is like the enemy here, and we need to be more
That's what I mean, though.
about that.
I was thinking of education as one of the main things, so that the person who's, let's say, commercially focused should understand that the conservation movement is actually in line with them, with their interest. They may not understand that. That's what we're trying to help with, is to say, if with the proper education and the proper funding, we actually, well, you pointed this out, everyone's water needs could be met when we're thinking about the steelhead.
Yeah.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it.
So do the people running the water agencies, Casitas and others, do they understand all this?
I think you're in a dialectic, honestly, like with the regulators and Casitas and the road. There was an all-day meeting I missed. I was on vacation last week at Robles to think about Robles redesign in the context of the Matilha project and the 8 million cubic yards of sediment behind that dam. And so there's a lot of thought going in. I think everybody acknowledges that the current design is adequate, but it's very polarized between the regulators and the water company at this point, and Casitas. I mean, it's just
the federal regulators.
Yeah. And
what's the polarization?
Everybody needs to just kind of like put their guns down and say, let's cooperate and see if we can come up with a new solution. The polarization is the way you cast the question, honestly, is that cubic foot per second for fish or people?
Right.
And
the water, I see.
Yeah. And the regulators are, blindered at the steelhead needs and, periodic flows and seasonal flows. And I'm still learning all the particularities of this watershed for that fish.
Are the regulators reasonable about this stuff? Can you work with them? Or are they ideological and
Both.
hard-nosed and difficult to do anything that is practical?
Both.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. Like when I mean, it depends who they're talking to, right? And I don't think you can just cast that
Does that change
stereotypical net across the whole agencies.
Does that change with the federal power changes, the president and the governor
at
and all
this
that
level,
stuff?
I mean,
Not
maybe
really.
if there were a lawsuit and how hard an agency, an administration wants to press on the implementation of a certain law, but day in and day out, I mean, these are rank and file civil servants.
Yeah.
You know,
Can I was hoping I could broaden the question that we're on right now. So what I would love to do is to say, I'm looking at, let's say, in the vision and the mission statement. So in the vision, you write, to lead Ojai Valley's response to climate change, which I love that line. And so the how I want to broaden the question is, that's going to take working with other agencies, municipalities. Right. So that's the city of Ojai, the county, Casitas you brought up. How are you finding working with those other agencies? You must have to all the time, I'm presuming.
It's great.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think pretty much everybody, not everyone, but most people acknowledge that the climate is changing, and that the way I phrase it is, climate mitigation is a global problem, but adaptation and resilience is a local problem. Really thinking about what we have to do. So one example I can give is current use law called Williamson Act. If you're familiar with this, it's where it helps farmers be farmers by giving them a tax deduction on their ag lands. Mm-hmm. In Ventura County, if you and you're some estate grower who, according to the farmers in most years, they came and sell these Valencias they're growing. Mm-hmm. And you take that you work with OVLC, we get some state money, we come in, we take your orange grove out and we plant oak trees. We've just lost 20% of your deduction.
On your property tax.
On your property tax under the Williamson Act. At this time, in this place, that makes no sense. Mm-hmm. It really doesn't. We should be investing in our ecosystem values here to really help ameliorate the effects we're feeling from climate change.
That's a great point.
Instead, what's happening, especially with the proposed rate changes at Casitas, is people are turning their water valves down to where the trees are either dying or hosting psyllid or causing problems for the air quotes here, legitimate farmers. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem we can help with, because we have the land tenure, we can do a conservation easement, mm-hmm. we have the restoration expertise, mm-hmm. we can play a really instrumental role. And I think that hews really mm-hmm. closely to some of the significant outcomes that need to be part of the management actions in the threatened adjudication, the potential settlement to the adjudication.
Right.
Because that's meaningful water.
Yeah.
So say more about what you just said. Covered a lot of ground, and I followed part of it, but not all of it.
Okay.
So can you say more? Let's just take an example of a piece of property and how this would work.
Say I'm a Hollywood producer.
Yeah.
And I bought my estate up in Ojai, and I've got 7 acres of Valencia oranges. I've got a land manager who's been Essex Orchard Management's been managing it. But I keep telling Roger and Mike to turn the water down because my bookkeeper's telling me I'm spending whatever $10,000 a year on water. I don't know what these figures are.
Yeah,
a month.
Yeah, more than I want to.
Yeah, and I can't sell the dang oranges anyway.
Right.
So then they find out that through the Department of Conservation, the State Department of Conservation, Ojai Valley Land Conservancy has an opportunity to come in, cut down my orange trees, and plant oak trees.
And you're gonna pay for that.
The state will pay us to do that.
Okay.
And the reason
I'm
they
not
will
gonna pay for it.
No.
Yeah, you are peripherally because you help fund the bonds.
But you're not directly paying.
The landowner. The landowner isn't gonna have to pay.
Right, correct. The landowner is not.
Okay. Depending. But
depending.
We'll
it would be great if you would.
Yeah.
Because then we wouldn't have to go get a state grant. But anyway. So in that context, and then we establish an oak woodland, which is not irrigated ag from a fire perspective, because you can't talk about climate adaptation in Ojai without always having fire front of mind. Mm-hmm. But it's a closed canopy oak woodland. It's second best probably to.
Do I lose control of that 7 acres?
Maybe, maybe not. You do if it's state funding, you'll not lose it, but you'll be required to allow OVLC to maintain the benefits of the restoration for 10 to 20 years usually.
So you can walk through it, you can hang out in it.
Yeah,
you just
it's like a conservation easement.
You just can't build in it.
So in that case, and then you're no longer producing a crop report. So then The county says, well, wait, you're no longer an agriculturalist. I'm going to put you in the open space level, which is only a 10% deduction on what you paid for on your value deduction based on your assessment. That makes no sense. And so, to your question about working with the agencies, I've been very candid. Do I really want to go to the county building? I mean, it's going to take years to get that change to Williamson Act through. And
the county could do that, though?
Yes. So Williamson Act is a state law that was created by Department of Conservation, and the counties all implement it as they see fit.
Okay.
Ventura County tends to do it in a relatively simplistic way, if I'm being honest. And there's not a lot of rangeland here, so they haven't had this challenge of really thinking about the conservation values of rangeland and what they provide back to the citizenry. That's an example, though, of where OVLC might play an instrumental role, and then would really have to work to change something that is, let's face it, if you are this Hollywood producer, maybe you don't even notice the 20% reduction in your valuation that is the basis of your taxes on your open land. But it's still a disincentive.
And I also want to add to that too, of not only do you lose your tax deduction, you also lose your ag water rate. And so we have been having discussions with the water companies about, well, could we do a conservation rate where they still get the lower rate for some amount of time while we establish the native plants, because for the first few years we do have to water, and find some balance there where they also don't lose that rate.
Right.
But then you asked, as the landowner, do you pay for it? In the example Tom gave, we can get grants if you have some sort of land tenure. But there are landowners in town who have removed their orchards and are paying us on a variety of different levels, depending on landowner, to either come out and do the work and restore their property, or provide them with plants, because we do have a native plant nursery, and consult with their crews on how to plant and when to water and how to maintain and how to restore their land. So there's a parcel in the East End that they took out their orchard, and then they're paying us to consult and buying plants from us to restore that.
Okay.
The last point is that the alternate, especially from a fire perspective, is, oh God, they just raised my rates 11%. I'm just shutting off the damn water, and you've got skeleton trees with a bunch of weeds.
Yes, right.
And fire sweeps through. Rates of spread are quite high.
Yep.
It looks horrible.
It looks horrible.
You see it happening.
It changes the character of the community.
I live in the East End. I see it happen.
Or even if the orchard comes
changes
out.
the character of where you're living, and whereas if you're down on the valley, now these slopes over here coming off of Nordoff Ridge aren't suited for oak restoration because of the hot sun. But if you plant oaks, you've got deep root channels that allow the water to get through. East End's pretty alluvial, the water goes right in, but over here in downtown Ojai,
canopy cover and
canopy
shade.
cover, fog capture, pollinators, habitat. I mean, there's just
So do people in the valley understand this?
They're gonna, darn it.
Yeah, good.
So that's a really good question. The Conservancy, this fall, we're going to be launching Rewild Ojai, and it's a program. Yes, it's very very cutely branded.
It looks great.
It's a program that essentially makes planting native plants cool. The thing to do, you just plant native plants. But it's much bigger as an organization. We're going to increase our nursery infrastructure to be able to grow more native plants. Part of that being protecting the local genotypes that have evolved, the species that have evolved here in the valley will grow from seeds and cuttings in the valley. We are going to provide more plants to the community. We're going to help people get them into yards, to empower them to feel like they're making a difference in providing for biodiversity and climate resilience, but then
and reduce water consumption.
Consumption. But then on top of that, we will really be promoting this private lands restoration with these larger landowners who are looking to take out their orchard, or they don't know what to do. We will be there to help provide any sort of levels of consultation or implementation for restoration of their property.
So given the limitations on building in Ojai, I mean, if I have this 7 acres, I don't have the option of building another house and subdividing. It's not an option. This seems like it's a wonderful solution.
We think so.
Well, but
that's why we do it.
Is there an opposing point of view? Is there a point of view that would say, well, yeah, that's okay for some people, but That hurts me in some way.
I think there's a lot of fear for increased fire risk.
Yeah.
Chaparral, for so many years, my focus in college was wildland fires and fuels management, and chaparral was number one enemy. And a lot of science is really showing that fire management takes place within the first 5 feet of your home, are absolutely important, how your home is built, but then the 100 feet, but then having bushes to help catch ember cast, and to have trees. Oak trees actually shoot water up into their leaves and help capture embers and slow fires. So having that biodiversity and plants around you isn't such a terrible thing. A lot of the new science is showing that we need to have plants, and we can't just be moonscaped in these devastating fires. And so I think that that's a big fear that is going to take a lot of education.
We heard that in 2019. We did a panel on that, and that a lot of what you're saying was reflected there. Even the fire breaks have this whole other difficulty of non-natives tending to emerge in the fire break, which is not something that.
And
I think another opposing view, again, with regard to fire, is that irrigated ag is seen, irrigated orchards is seen as the ultimate buffer, which it probably is.
Yeah, we don't deny that.
We don't deny that. But that's changing. Like, you can wish it weren't so, but that's not going to get you very far. When you climb Shelf Road and you look down, you see brown patch, brown patch,
It's
brown
true.
patch, brown patch. And we need to think adaptively about our community. And one of the Ojai Valley Land Conservancy's principal purposes is to preserve the character of this place. And that's true of any land trust anywhere. And maybe it's not orange trees, but oak trees, again, for us is a close second.
I'll tell you, hiking Gridley, you saw the avocados burn when it was really hot a couple years ago. You could see this isn't going to sustain if the temperatures keep rising like that.
Yeah.
The other point I wanted to make about Rewild Ojai and about, we should talk some about land acquisition, is that both programs have been enabled by a couple key family foundations in the Valley that really helped us staff up to this program, and to think about the nursery expansion and think about having this expansive vision of our role in the Valley, because
that's really great.
You can get funding for the projects, like multi-benefit land repurposing is the program that the Department of Conservation has right now. That does, by the way, shift, although it's California, so it's always Democratic, but that does shift administration, what the focal area is. Right now it's really water, and our Assemblyman Steve Bennett has been a champion for water in the legislature. But that does shift.
Can I ask
but the core program to go get those grants and to fund the staff, that comes from individual family philanthropy.
Don't lose your train of thought. What I wanted to ask is,
If I do, it won't be your fault.
Okay. Well, you said something that I liked. You said that sort of thinking of climate change as more of a global situation, but then we address it locally. I'm paraphrasing what you said.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that principle gets used a lot with all different kinds of things that happen in the city and the valley generally. Like, should we build this building in the city, not on a property in the East End? Should we use electric versus gas blowers? All these questions come up all the time in our city council, for example. And I know it gets leveraged to say, well, let's not build, let's say, an affordable housing project because it's going to be contrary to our environmental well-being. So how do we manage that thoughtfully? How do we think about that? In other words, if that's going to be a factor in making our decisions, what's the reasonable way to approach that question?
Well, geez, there's the $10,000.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking for data, I guess. Let me give you an example. Richard Hages, who's the board president of Casitas, said we have 1,000 acre feet set aside for new development. Okay, that's what I mean by a fact. So if somebody were to say, there's no water, the water's all running away, you have Richard here saying that 1,000 acre feet are set aside for new development. Now, is that a 20-story high-rise? No. But is it 4 units on Franklin? Yes, no problem. So that's the kind of answer I guess I'm hoping for, is what's the reasonable way to then try to find a balanced approach to these questions?
Do you have?
Go ahead.
So I think a responsible community-based conservation organization has to think, the way I phrase it is about the gray some. We're all about the green, we're all about the nature, but we also have to think a little bit about the gray and that balance between a vibrant, ideally what you see is a vibrant village and lots of green space and open lands around it. I mean, that's what we have now in Ojai. That's what OVLC exists to help protect on the green side.
Yeah.
I think where we cross over in that are some of the proactive and innovation style elements around water capture and what role we might play in that, what role we might play as a management entity within the adjudication. I don't want to be the referee if there ever is a referee created, but I'll sure be interested in being a quarterback to help figure out some of those solutions to help ameliorate that.
Is water capture viable? Is that?
We
could do that. Could be done.
It's happening already.
It already has happened at the Ojai Meadows Preserve.
But it could. But I mean, in a larger scale, on a larger scale.
Yeah, I know Watershed Progressive was talking to the city about that little pocket park at the bay where the jog and signal is. That little park, and could you shunt some of the stormwater coming off the hill there into a groundwater injection well there? You would need to have some treatment because you gotta get the dog poo and hydrocarbons out before you send it down into the ground. But that's all doable. I mean, the technology exists to do this.
So, but is the balance between the cost and the benefit appropriate to putting resources?
I can't answer
into
that now. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
The other place that everybody always thinks about, I call it Ojai Meadows Preserve 2.0, are the Krishnamurti-Crotona fields along 33. When you think about all the impervious surface at the Y, Vaughn's and the hospital and all that stuff, all that creates excessive flood flows down San Antonio Creek through the channeling of storm water. Our field crew, it's like Groundhog Day. Whenever there's a big flood, they have to go redo a bunch of restoration work that the county has to pay for, buy the plants all over again, go plant them again, because it's just these crushing flows down San Antonio Creek. We could attenuate those peaks and get some water into the ground using those fields.
Yeah.
And I know there's willingness at Krishnamurti. I haven't talked to Crotona about it, but it's just a matter of finding the bandwidth to plan it.
No, just for people watching, you're talking about all that open land. When you're driving down, you're heading out of the valley to the right there, where you see the Ojai Retreat up on the hill, all that land that's open there.
Yep.
That would be the place that we would sequester.
Yeah,
Okay.
because that's what happened over off of Maricopa Highway with the meadows. Now, a lot of that water during really high flows just gets into the Happy Valley drain and goes out to the river. The county did come to us, but the geography wasn't right for doing stormwater capture and infiltration on the west side of the Meadows Preserve. But I think the board would have been totally open to it. It just, the geometry wasn't right.
There are new people coming into the valley all the time.
Like me.
Some of them people who could help quite a bit if they wanted to. Is that happening? You have a way to connect with new money coming to the Ojai Valley that
we talk about all the time. I mean, that's half of our, more than half of our job. So we talk about how to reach that cohort all the time. Yeah, and I would say
some of the new people have been incredibly supportive. I don't know that I had this conversation last night. I don't know that a lot of people have been brought up with philanthropy as part of what they do, and so there's a lot of education, I think, too, of being part of your community and being philanthropic and the impact you can make by donating to your local organizations. But some relationships we've built, but we're definitely always looking for more. Especially this year, we're looking at a lot of really big projects, and we're going to have to raise a lot of capital for those.
So partly I'm asking that question because it seems to me a big problem in the community that new people come here and it's maybe a second residence or a summer residence, and they love the beauty of the place and the charm of the valley, and they want to have a place here, but they don't feel themselves part of the community. So for example, we have public schools that are run down and not being run well, and the population has plummeted in half, and it's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And the new person who comes to town is going to send their kids to a private school, which we have plenty of. And so what's the problem? So I get the benefit of this community, but I don't have to participate in anything. I don't have to do anything. I just go up there when I like it, and there it is. That seems to be a big problem.
I would say that tactically, that OVLC is in as we said before, a little bit unique of an advantage in that we have 27 miles of trails. And a lot of those people move here because they like to mountain bike or horseback ride or hike the trails. And so that gives us a point of contact with them. We also have a new All About Ojai series that I've met a ton of new residents in town. The most recent one we did, that Bill was bummed to have missed, by the way, is we misnetted for bats, and I got to handle bats, and the biologist handled the bats in the hand. And that, events like that, events like
Mountain film.
Mountain film.
Mountain
We meet a
film's
lot of.
A huge driver of us connecting with new people, for sure. It's our big event that happens the third weekend in September, and we have a big 2,000 person movie night on the field at OVS.
Oh, nice.
And
It's huge.
And
It's
Tom,
really
I also
nice.
think that this narrative, where it's not just sort of stayed, we're going to work with the old guard to protect the place before it gets ruined by all those other people, but this narrative of we're going to innovate for a changing climate will resonate more deeply because everybody's reading about the climate. So I think having this a bit out of the box kind of embracing of climate and water issues, because mostly land trusts, adhere to Mark Twain, water's for fighting over. That may be a way to sort of show that while we're a small valley, we're doing outsized things that can be an example of the rest of the continent.
And
Seems right to me.
Yeah.
And it seems like that, but what I'm trying to get to is that what I like about that is that it creates a sense of community. That as a person coming here, I have an opportunity and even a responsibility to contribute to the welfare of the community in a general sense, a more general sense. I think that's a big deal. And if this is a mechanism that goes in that direction,
Right.
wonderful.
And I think that another part of it too is our volunteer program is really grown and really helps capture a lot of new people that might not interact with other organizations or the community in that way. Last year, I guess it's been 2 years now, we invested in a volunteer, an events coordinator, and that really helped us grow our volunteer program to where we had 6,000 hours, volunteer hours this past fiscal year of people contributing to helping rebuild the trails.
It's over 3 full-time staff, right?
Yeah,
that's great.
and those people are invested in our organization in a different way, and it really helps bring in new donors to help support us as well.
It's interesting, just to riff on that for a second. During COVID, we got, I'd get these gushy emails from people and phone calls about how important the preserves were, and thank you for not closing all the preserves when the county shut down everything. And then we had this catastrophic flooding this year, and the trails all got blown out. And it's gone 180 degrees where the community has been the source of resilience for OVLC and our trail system.
That's great.
It's just done this complete flip-flop where we were the source of resilience, emotionally, for people to get away from their families, and then it's flipped 180 degrees. Now we had over 6,000 hours, and people volunteer on everything. They'll stuff envelopes, and everything we need done. There's a volunteer that might be there to do
That's
it.
great.
And it really was. There's always been volunteers at OVLC. It started as a volunteer entity.
Yeah.
Sort of the Margaret Mead thing, but having somebody who's there to manage and help the rest of the staff manage through their particular discipline, how can volunteers help, has just been a boon. And so we're going to continue that investment.
It's been
That's
incredible.
great.
We had
So what do you need?
Well, so we haven't talked land acquisition.
that's
let's talk about that.
Yeah, so again, thanks to the generosity of 2 family foundations in town, we hired a land protection specialist, because for years, always, the executive director is who does the land deals, and executive directors have a lot to do already, and land deals are tedious. There's just a lot of details. So in addition to that philanthropy, I also got a very generous pro bono lawyer agreement with Alan Matkins, who provides legal support for our land deals. And we have about 230 acres. We closed on just under 10 acres on San Antonio Creek recently, but we have 230 acres that we should close on in the next 2 months. And that's creates a whole nother level. I mean, every piece of land is forever. So you got to always think about stewardship and startup and what do we need. And You know, and so, you know, our stewardship staff does an analysis of how hard this property is likely going to be, and then you think about, well, if you're only spending 5% of the corpus on any annual year, you need that much money. And so we'll be doing a capital campaign to help support the new lands. We need some of the new folks to get involved, I would say. We need support for our capital campaigns. What else do we need? More land deals.
More land deals. I think that we've grown tremendously. Not just have the two family foundations funded the land protection specialist, but also another 3 very generous donors have funded the startup costs for our Rewild Ojai program, and that in turn has allowed us to hire a full-time native plant specialist and a nursery manager, and that gives us a runway to get that program off the ground as well. And so we've been growing. When I started 10 years ago, we had a staff of about 7. This year we're looking at a staff of 20. 2 more of those positions are actually funded by another family foundation. They're nursery interns from the high schools, and they apply and do an internship.
Part of the Green Valley Project.
Yeah. And so we've grown a lot, and so we're looking at this very, very robust and very aspiring budget this year to support this momentum that we've gone. But now having these extra staff to get the land deals done and to get this program off the ground, and all of a sudden we have all these capital campaigns coming into fruition that we're like, oh, we can finally buy land. We've got someone working on this, and so now we're looking at this big budget and these capital campaigns for land.
Got it. So your numbers are all public, right? So can you just give me a quick sketch of like how many people, how much money have you got, what's your annual budget, that kind of stuff, just for the benefit of the...
So we're looking at about 20 staff. 4 of those are part-time. The 2 nursery interns are very part-time. 5 of them are part-time, maybe. Our budget, when I started 10 years ago, it was approaching $1 million, which was crazy. And this year we're looking at $2.5 million budget, and that's aside from the capital campaigns.
And the land costs aren't part of your operating budget. You know.
So operating budget $2.5 million.
Right.
And that goes to people mainly.
People and equipment and you know upkeep and
And then on the
usual overhead stuff.
On the asset side, do you keep track of the value of the assets?
We do, but it's how you book that. I think we're at 18 million in our on the
when
balance sheet.
When you think of all that land?
And then we did settle with SoCal Edison after the damages to the Thomas fire. So and the board had the wisdom to put the proceeds of the settlement into a stewardship fund for the long-term management of the land. Because one thing I did when I got here is I said, wait, everybody should be on their own base. We need to understand how this cost within this organization is distributed. And stewardship was at a huge deficit every year because there was no endowment for most of our land. We had a couple small endowments where we overshot the mark or something. And so the board said, oh, when that windfall came in, I can't talk about it, it's a material part of the settlement agreement. They said that's all for stewardship.
So there is an endowment.
There is
how
a
big
small
is it?
endowment. Our current endowment, can I say that?
Our current endowment is about $10 million. We invested...
Because that doesn't speak to the settlement.
When we settled on that endowment, the markets all crashed and we've lost a significant amount, but we're starting to climb back up.
Think about the timing of when we might have settled and what happened in the markets in the last 3 years.
But probably half of our staff are grant funded, whether it's government grants or private foundation grants, and then the other half are funded by the community and the money.
Restoration, other than Rewild Ojai, the restoration program has always been hand-to-mouth government funding with some profit, if you will, some revenue coming off because we charge more than we pay
to help support the administration of the organization.
Can I add though, or can you talk about you on your 5-year strategic plan? You talk about a thriving workforce now, and that people can afford to live here. So maybe talk about that.
So that's something that is really important to us. Is we love this valley, and the people that work for us are working every day to protect what they love and to work on what they love about this valley, but most of them can't afford to live here. I live in my grandma's house.
I live in workforce housing.
Tom lives in one of the houses that the Conservancy owns. It's a very nice house.
It's the old Hollingsworth estate, and I call it workforce housing.
One of our staff lives in an ADU that a board member has, and a lot can't live in town anymore, and so we are buying a new parcel currently that should close soon that will have a house on it. And so we're looking to that as another employee housing option. In the past, if someone left us a home, we would immediately turn around and sell it. We wouldn't want to own and maintain that. But now we're in a very different place with affordable housing that we would actually think about keeping that, and depending on the state, obviously, and supporting our staff in that way. The stewardship endowment is huge. It's really common for land trusts to, in the beginning, take on a lot of land without an endowment and then realize how expensive it is to maintain something forever, especially if it's open to the public, like we talked about before. And so that's someday when we start to have revenue off the endowment, that will help. We've yet to ever be able to draw on it. That'll help, but in an ideal world, we would have a large enough endowment to steward our lands and to fund the operations of, robust health care for our employees and to be able to pay a thriving wage. I think the living wage in Ventura County is $25 an hour right now.
Living wage, meaning that's the amount you need in order to live here?
Yeah. And while we're not
distinct from a thriving wage, which
which probably is closer up to 30, I would say. While we've come a long way, when I got here, the field crew who did a lot of our restoration work were part-time employees. They didn't have benefits. They weren't really part of the core staff. Now they're full-time staff. They get benefits and vacation time and sick days. And we've brought them up from minimum wage employees. We're not as far as we want. And each year we make strides to push a little bit farther in our budget. But ideally, we'd have that operational endowment to help fund, just say, like a robust healthcare plan. Maybe we get dental and vision at some point. That would be our goal. And to support our younger employees who are just starting out in their career in those positions with a place to live and a stable place where they don't have to worry about that. And we had our first Pushing Up Poppy's Legacy Giving Dinner. It's for people who have included the OVLC in their estate plans. And we had 30 people come out. It was a lovely evening. And those bequests are really a way for us to grow that endowment, to ensure the long-term sustainability of an organization.
And honestly, it's kind of a easy leap, I guess. I don't know what the right words. Legacy gift for the legacy of the organization. It sort of helps secure our place in the valley, for generations to come.
So in most European countries, this function you're serving would be done by the government, right?
I think so. I
think
there's
that's the case.
There's a new international land conservation network that's created because the United States really has forged private lands conservation and outside of a government context. So yes, I would say that's accurate.
So
and I would say in the underdeveloped world as well.
So you've managed to engineer a solution in this country.
Well, we're not done yet.
But you've made a lot of progress.
Yeah.
Well,
You've made a lot of progress.
And I think that that's something that people are pleasantly surprised about, is they think of us as the Trails organization, and then they sit down and talk to us and we're like, well, are you interested in restoration? Are you interested in the jobs we're providing? Are you interested in fire? Are you interested in water? We have so many things that we work on, and even when we send our staff to rally, I think they're often surprised at how our little land trust in Ojai really does really big and great things.
Yeah, it was interesting. We talked so much about water today. I had a call with the director of the Methow Conservancy in central Washington, and they just did a water transaction with the local tribe, water for nature transaction. Now, the context of water law in Washington State, it's totally balkanized in the West. Every state's got its own picadillos, but we're going to get together at Rally. I'm going next month, and we're going to try to see if we can't create some sort of Western water network to start thinking about what role can land trusts play. The one thing we didn't talk about is how acquisition hews to climate change.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, OVLC, we're about your views and your wildlife and your trails. You know, we've largely, pretty much all the projects we have in the hopper right now are on rivers. And so that's obviously important. Protecting riparian areas is important for all the reasons we talked about. But when you think about climate and how the climate's shifting, we got funding from the Land Trust Alliance to do a kind of a climate modeling exercise. And you start thinking about north and northeast facing slopes. You don't have to be a global climate scientist to know that those are the cooler, wetter places.
Just a hiker.
You just have to be a hiker or a golfer or whatever. You don't have to even be a hiker. You just have to know that when I'm outside and I'm on a northeast facing slope, there's more oak trees, there's more moisture. And so we have a prioritization model for that. We've also, because of all the focus on groundwater, we've also looked at potential recharge. And so a piece maybe in the East End that otherwise would not have been, it would have just been thought of as a postage stamp and not sort of on the urban fringe. Maybe we buy that because it has such great recharge potential. And so we've really thought about how can we tweak our acquisition priorities to help with this adaptation and resilience to our changing climate.
Can I add to that? Because it's not,
Of course.
we've talked a lot about restoration, but really the best tool that we have is to protect the lands that are already providing things. So protecting the north-facing slopes. When we talk about fire, having that clean wildland urban interface, and so purchasing private parcels that would start to add another home out in the wildlands, just protecting those helps solidify our border for fire.
Right.
So our first strategy and our first step is acquisition. And
I always call it no regrets because you just don't. It's hard to imagine a parcel in Ojai on the urban fringe where some subdivision would have been the better solution.
Right
now.
Well, we saw that in Ventura, right, during the fire. All the things that were right up to the mountains burned. Not all of them, but some burned terribly, right? So we saw that. So you're saying buy that land, you build more of a buffer, essentially, right?
Yeah, and even if you have, you have Shelf Road, and let's just say you were to put a house up in the hills right by there, you have to spend all those resources to protect that home rather than holding the border at Shelf.
Understand.
And so that helps too.
That's how fire managers think about it.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
We're out of time.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.